Regardless of what society tells you, you can raise your kids to live a debt-free life and to stay debt-free forever. Let's talk about it. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos on raising intentional kids and living intentional lives. We publish a new video every Friday. For decades, debt has been a part of American life. So the days are gone whenever a mortgage was the only sizable debt anyone would ever have. Today, it's not uncommon to see a car payment that's the same size as a house payment was in the 90s. Or to see a car payment that's more than somebody's house payment, but that's a different topic for a different video. And in 2015, Standard & Poor's conducted a financial literacy survey and actually found that Americans are getting financially dumber. So financial literacy has been decreasing over the decades and debt has been increasing. Makes sense. And Americans hold a combined total of over $1 trillion in credit card debt alone now, and over $13 trillion in debt in general. And this debt does include those who use credit cards and pay it off monthly. It still shows up, but 6 in 10 Americans do carry a balance on their credit card, which means they're paying those crazy interest rates. In fact, around half of that $1 trillion in credit card debt is revolving debt that goes from month to month. And auto loans alone are more than $1 trillion themselves. That's the bad news. The good news is your kids don't have to fall into that trap. You don't either if you can dig your way out if you're in it, or if you're not in it, you can stay out of debt, but your kids definitely don't have to fall into the debt trap. Not getting in beats getting out. Let's be real, most Americans are broke. 70% of Americans are in debt and 50% think they always will be. 78% are living paycheck to paycheck, and most Americans don't have enough savings to cover even the smallest emergencies. If you read an article on getting out of debt and becoming debt-free, the first step is almost always, as it should be, don't get into any more debt. So if your child hasn't left home yet, they can skip that step. They may not even need the article at all. And that one step puts him a step ahead of most Americans. And that step could mean all the difference. It's fairly easy to not get into debt. It's really difficult to dig your way out of debt. And it is possible for your kid to never pay interest a day in their life on anything. And it is possible for your kids to never pay interest a day in their life. Again, it's fairly easy. All they have to do is refuse debt. It is very possible and sustainable to live a debt-free lifestyle. Refusing debt starts by refusing credit cards. Let's talk about the psychology of spending. I've been through many stages of the cash versus credit debate. I started by spending everything on credit cards and never paying them off and just getting in a whole bunch of debt. And then I started reading Dave Ramsey and I cut up all my credit cards because that's what he tells you to do. And I completely started living on cash, and then we got completely debt free. And then I got into credit card rewards and I started using credit cards again, and I started using 100% credit cards on all my purchases and then got the rewards. But now I'm actually back to preferring cash over credit. So let's talk about that. Studies began a few decades ago looking into the spending habits of people who use credit cards compared with cash spenders. In 2001, MIT did a study involving college students bidding on 3 different items. When the students were allowed to use credit cards, they spent between 80% and 100% more than students using only cash. A decade later, a study in the Journal of Consumer Research gave some insight into why people spend more with credit than cash. It turns out people tend to associate credit cards with the benefits of the product they're buying, yet they associate paying cash with the cost of the product. This isn't by accident, it's mostly marketing. We have the major credit card companies to thank for this, but the cost versus benefit isn't the only reason people spend more money with credit cards. Hal E. Hirschfield, PhD, explains that when we purchase on credit, we have more time to think about the purchase, between the time of the transaction and the time we actually pay the bill, and then we often regret the purchase entirely. Studies continue to confirm that we spend more money when we use credit cards. We just do. From restaurant tips to auto tolls, we simply spend more money in every area when we use a credit card, according to a study from Value Penguin. So I'm not saying any of that to scare you. I just want to talk about credit cards and other types of debt. So let's talk about 5 areas where your kids can live differently to live this debt-free lifestyle and not get caught up in all this marketing and all these credit cards and all this stuff. Number 1, credit cards. Credit card rewards versus overspending. I'm all for credit card rewards, but whenever we look at the studies that we just talked about, I'm not so sure that they are worth it after all. And to be honest, I do still use credit cards right now as of this video recording, but I am considering switching to cash, and I have been for a while now. It just would take a few changes because we do live in Japan, so you have the US dollar and you have yen, and it is a little more difficult here. But I am considering making the switch, or at least doing like a 30-day challenge just to see literally how much I actually spend on cash versus credit. In the book Deep Work, Cal Newport talks about the any benefit of things, and I think that applies to credit cards. We use them for the any benefit, we don't think about the most benefit. So basically, if something provides any benefit to your life, you think it's a benefit. But in reality, there's probably another solution, or there could be another solution that provides the most benefit, and that's what you want to go with. This is a great example of that when it comes to credit versus cash. So while it's plain to see that credit cards do offer benefits and they offer these rewards and stuff, I do think cash offers the most benefit. And I'm highly intentional with my budget, and I do check our budget every day, and I put all our expenses in, but I still believe I would spend less if I used cash, which is why I'm gonna try that challenge. We're gonna do it. Cash is real. We see it leaving our hand. We have to pull out the exact amount for the item and give it to the person. It's not the same as just putting our credit card up there and letting it read our chip, or just now you can just set it on top or take your phone and it just beep, and then $500 or however much. I just think too often we're chasing credit card rewards while we're spending entirely more than we would if we were spending cash, and we're sometimes also digging ourselves into a hole of debt. So those studies said that we spend 80 to 100% more whenever we use credit versus cash, and if we just said, oh, I don't believe that, it's probably 70, 60, 50, whatever. Just take a conservative estimate of, say, 10%. If we spend 10% more when we use credit versus cash, I think any of us would agree we spend at least that much more. Is it worth the 1 or even 5% cash back to spend 10% more? No, it's not. That's the answer. So perhaps we should encourage our kids to not get caught up in the credit card trap and to not worry so much about it, and to start their life off using cash. Why encourage credit for the any benefit whenever we could encourage cash for the most benefit, and also take away the possibility of our child drowning in debt by getting caught up in credit cards. If your kids decide to avoid credit cards and they never get caught up in that, then I'm gonna give a score as we go through this so we can see where your child stacks up. So based on what we just talked about, your child 1, credit card debt 0. They're winning. Number 2, car payments, the great car payment myth. Oh, car payments. Everyone has one, right? Actually, no. Car payments are more of a poor and lower middle class thing. Not because they're poor or they have less money, but because they buy more car. There are studies that show this. Car payments are getting higher and car term lengths are getting longer, up to an average of 66 months. And on top of that, Americans are borrowing almost $1,000 more on the average loan than we did just a few years ago. In the book The Millionaire Next Door, Thomas J. Stanley talks about car payments and how millionaires typically don't have car payments, not because they're millionaires again, but because they typically drive a car that's a few years older. So they let someone else take the depreciation, so they get a better deal on the car, and they can pay cash for the car. The only car payment your child should ever have is a car payment to themselves in an interest-bearing account, so that they're getting interest on that car payment instead of paying interest on the car payment. If they start saving at a young age and put a certain amount every month into an account and they gain interest on it, they'll have enough money to pay cash for a car when the time comes. And as soon as they buy their car, they immediately start putting another car payment in an interest-bearing account, but they start making that car payment as soon as they buy their car with cash, so that over the years, 5, 10 years, however long it is before they need a new car, or another car, not a new car, then they'll have that money to pay cash for it. And they can keep this going for the rest of their lives. If your child puts just $400 a month into a savings account that bears practically no interest, at the end of 5 years, they'll have $24,000. It's a pretty good deal, especially since you didn't pay any interest on it. So if your child decides not to go the standard American way of having a car payment, then their score continues. Your child, 2. Auto loan debt, 0. Number 3, student loans, how to get a debt-free degree. What about college? Student loans are necessary if you want to get into a good school and get a good degree, right? You have to have student loans. No, you definitely don't. Student loans aren't a necessary evil. It's actually fairly easy to go to college without student loans at all. I did an entire video on how to get a debt-free degree, so I'm not going to go into the details of all of that, but I will just quickly give the 5 ways that I talk about in that video, and then for more specifics, I'll put a link to that and you can go watch that video. Number 1, choose an affordable college in the first place. Number 2, simply save for college. Number 3, apply for scholarships like it's a full-time job. Number 4, work your way through college. Number 5, join the military.
You can choose what you want to be trained score before you enlist.
It turns out that everyone has student loans is just another myth. Now, those are 5 different options and different ways to get a debt-free degree, and you can combine them. But the fact is, your kids don't have to have student loans. And even if everyone does have them, that doesn't mean your child has to. So, your child's score, 3. Student loan debt, 0. Number 4, home loans. How to never have a mortgage. Mortgages are kind of like car payments, but it's more understandable because most people do need a loan to get something that costs 6 figures. That still doesn't mean that everyone needs one. And it definitely doesn't mean that you ever have to have one or that your child has to have one. It seems like as part of the American dream, as soon as we move out at 18 or 19 or whenever, we're encouraged to buy our first home. Supposedly we need our first home, and we hear things like renting is throwing your money away, or you need to buy a home for your family's sake, you need your own home, it's so important. Both of those statements aren't technically true. They can be, but they're usually not the case. Renting is a necessary way of progressing into and through adulthood, and at no point do you ever need to buy a house. And I'm also not saying that you should never buy a home, because there will come a time whenever you want your own home. I get that, and you want to paint the walls if you want to, or add on if you want to. You want to do whatever you want to with the home, but that doesn't have to mean a 30-year mortgage or going into debt at all to make that happen. If you have to finance something, you can't afford it. If you take that mentality into home ownership, it seems like nobody can afford anything, really. But here's the secret. You can't. You can't afford the house that you're in, most likely, if you're an American. Statistically, not pointing fingers, just saying statistically you can't. And especially when you're first starting out. That's why it's called a starter home. It shouldn't be much of a home, at least not yet. So I want to quickly go through the trade-up approach to home buying. If your child starts saving for their first house as soon as they move out, in about 10 years, they can have enough money for a decent starter home, a very small home. During those 10 years, if they're simply renting as inexpensively as possible and saving everything they can, they might be surprised at how much they can actually accumulate towards buying a home. And a lot of people will say things like, well, mortgages have really low interest rates, so shouldn't we take the low interest on that loan? But even with a low interest rate, you buy a $200,000 house, you're still paying $400,000 or $500,000 for that house over 20 or 30 years, depending on how long the loan is. So if your child is able to save the money over the first 10 years while they're renting, they can buy that starter home, continue to save, and then theoretically the value of their starter home would go up. So then whenever they're ready to buy their next home, they've saved enough money and their home is increased in value. They can sell their home and they can buy another home that's bigger and nicer. So in 30 years, they will have that really nice house, but they didn't have to pay the extra hundreds of thousands of dollars in interest. And if your child refuses to do this trade-up approach and paying cash for a home, and that's fine, I understand that, but make sure they at least get a 15-year, if not shorter, loan so that they're not paying 3 or 4 times the value of the house. They're actually just paying like 1 or 1.5 times the value of the house. So if your child does follow this path of cash buying homes, your child 4. Mortgage debt 0. Number 5, credit scores. Do you really need one? All of this debt-free talk always leads to the big question whenever I talk to anyone about this is, but what about their credit score? What about my credit score? Whatever, whenever they're talking about going cash on all these options, what about the credit score? Well, you don't need a credit score. Now, a lot of people are going to fight me on this, and then some people have heard this before, like, oh, I've heard this, and I know what you're going to say. But just hear me out. I'm not against having a credit score. So a credit score is just a debt score, and you can see that by looking at your FICO, for example, to see how it's made up. 30% is the amount you owe on different things, so the amount of debt you're in. 10% is new credit, aka new debt. 15% is length of credit history, so how long you've been in debt for. 10% is the credit mix, so different types of debt. And 35%, the most important part of it, is the payment history, which is how often you've paid on time on all of your debt. If your child never gets into debt and they never plan to get into debt, they don't need a credit score. So I did a quick search to figure out why people think you still need a credit score even if you're not living in debt and all this stuff, or the reason that people harp so big on them. And I don't feel like the reasons are justified. I found a few different articles. Let's look at this US News article. So they gave 5 reasons. Number 1, renting an apartment. Number 2, buying a home. Number 3, refinancing student loans. Number 4, getting a credit card. Number 5, getting your next job. The Balance gave 5 reasons as well. As a side note, I do appreciate that the Balance also wrote an article on living without debt and without a FICO score, but they did give 5 reasons in a separate article. Their reasons were similar, but they added having a low car payment, funding a small business, and utilities. Basically, those are 8 different things that supposedly warrant a credit score, so let's address each one of these pretty quickly. Well, you don't need credit to rent an apartment or get your next job, you simply need references. Moreover, if you explain your debt-free lifestyle, that will typically intrigue the apartment manager or employer and often set you apart from the competition. If you don't use debt to finance your home, your degree, your business, or your car, you won't need a credit score for any of those. You'll just need actual money. The only thing that may change when it comes to your utilities, if you don't have a credit score, is that you'll have to pay a deposit, which you will get back because it's a deposit. I'm not going to address the credit card point, I think you get the idea. So those are 8 reasons basically debunked if your child isn't planning on living a debt lifestyle. And if you can find one small thing that does require a credit score even if you're living debt free, I promise it's not worth it. So let's look at your kid's score now. Your child, 5. Your child's credit score, 0. Literally, but in both ways. They're winning, your kid's winning. So your kids can win this debt fight 5-0. Those are the 5 main areas that debt creeps into people's lives: credit cards, auto loans, mortgages, student loans, and the quote-unquote need for a credit score. I'm not going to mention things like payday loans and short-term loans, personal installment loans. I don't think I have to say anything about that here. Even debt lovers and credit score chasers know that most of those things like payday and short-term loans are a dumb idea. So if you have them, just pay them off and stop. This is a pretty radical way to live and a lot of people scoff at it, but I wish I would have known all of this when I was 18 and I wouldn't have got myself into all the debt that I had to dig my way out of. And again, that was my whole goal behind starting Freedom Sprout in the first place, was that we're teaching kids how to stay debt free and how to live financially responsible lives so that we're not teaching them how to dig their way out of debt later. We don't have to worry about that. It can be a hard paradigm shift to think in this debt-free lifestyle way, but it's worth it, and it's good to be different because the average person is broke and the average person is in debt. You don't want to be average. Please subscribe for more videos on money, minimalism, and our travel journey around the world. If you're interested in raising intentional kids, I do have an entire chapter in that book about kids and debt and raising debt-free kids. I'll put a link to that below, but you can check out my new book, Intentional Children. That is all for today. I will see you next week.